My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord.
This morning's lesson, cognizance that we've got to keep it brief. We've got a wonderful banquet this afternoon for our elderly and honoured guests, honoured individuals. So looking forward to, or at least I hope you're looking forward to that. So this morning, to get into our lesson, our topic is, we continue on our theme of carrying the cross, and mine is becoming God's signet ring. Here we go. So, as an introduction, in 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 9, Peter says this about royalty, and he says, "But you are a chosen race," referring to us, the church, very specific, us Christians, "a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession." We saw from Brother Daniel's lesson about at what great cost God paid to purchase us. And here we are, his possession. "That you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." So here we have this opening statement about royalty that we are a part of. Not just something common, something ordinary, something just by the way, but royal, special, set apart. And God paid a dear price to purchase us, to make us holy and perfect in his sight. Once you were not a people. We didn't belong to anything. We didn't belong to, we were an outcast. We were lost. We were without hope. We were without anything. We couldn't call ourselves anything. And here God reminds us, or Peter reminds us, once we were not a people, but now you are God's people. Now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. As Christians, God has selected and set us up and set us apart, from those who are not called by his name. From those who are not called by his name. So we have a very special name. Christians, named after Christ, who rescued us, who saved us. And this is whom we belong to when we put on the name of Christian. This designation comes with very special rights and privileges, which is only found within royal families and households. So I was reading up about famously the British Empire, and the royal family of the British Empire, still a significant influence, I think, on the whole world, and what they say, what they do, the press, the media that's around them, still significant to all of us. I'm sure in the Zulu family, for the Zulu people, would be the same, their royal families and households and the privileges that they have. But we too have this very special designation, special rights and privileges. in that the royal family is considered above everyone else, who has authority to rule and to be honored for having that authority. We cannot meagerly just walk in and, how's it, Queenie? Well, when she was still Queen, still alive, how are you doing? Casually help ourselves, that she'll walk down our streets and, greet us casually. There is very strict protocol in how we greet my gran, back to my gran, teaching us table manners. Would always say, what would the Queen say? And there's strict rules as to how we are to use our knives and forks, and we had always more than a knife, more than one knife and more than one fork at my gran's table. Odd, but that's how the Queen would eat. Multiple spoons, multiple saucers and stuff, and that was a saucer for this, and that's a plate for that, and so on and so forth. Couldn't eat a fish with a normal knife, and blah blah blah. That's the era that my gran came from. But these were all considered the rights that the royal family had over everybody else, us common folk who use a normal knife to eat fish with. Starting with King David, God promised his throne would last forever. So, from the royal privilege and responsibility, starting from King David, God made this promise to him, that his throne would last forever. And through his bloodline, Christ's kingdom would be established. Now that's quite a significant thing. I don't know how many other family bloodlines are still existing. Even the Windsor bloodline is shaky at best, and whether their royal family line will last to the very end is very doubtful. But here God made a promise to David, your bloodline would last to the establishment of a kingdom forever. And through Christ's blood, we are redeemed and conferred as royal, belonging to the household of God. That was quite an achievement. However, and I'll get to that, however, this royal privilege must be maintained. It can be taken away from us. So we need to maintain this royal privilege through continuous work within God's household, through daily renewal and daily cleansing. It's not something we can take for granted. It's not something that this is what God did for me and I'm saved forever. No. There is work that each and every one of us need to do to maintain this royal status. For as easily as the Queen can kick out her children out of the royal family, so too Christ can very easily kick us out of the royal family if we too falter and not follow the rules and the guidelines that God has set before us to follow. Cleansing to reach a state of purity. For this is where God is. He is in a place of purity. No evil, no wickedness, no sin. And we cannot be a part of that. So God requires of us to reach a state of purity, to put aside the sin, put aside the wickedness, and pursue each and every day. Yet we're not going to be perfect every day, but we take a conscious effort towards that step and not just take it for granted. So cleansing states and separation from sin. A responsibility to be of service to God and to his people. Now I want to turn our attention to Zerubbabel, who was the governor of Judah. The southern kingdom, as we know, Judah, came to an end and was conquered by the Babylonians in approximately 586 BC. So that was the story of Nebuchadnezzar, and we see that at the end of 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Jeremiah. So Nebuchadnezzar conquers the southern kingdom and destroys. A third of the inhabitants are exiled, a third died from pestilence, and a third are killed from the battle and the brutal and the war. Traditionally, the king and the royal family And all the descendants of that royal family would have been killed to ensure that the one who's conquering the enemy could not re-establish themselves and take back their kingdom. So in essence, if I were the conqueror and I've conquered a kingdom, I would wipe out that generation. I would wipe out that royal family to ensure that there is no chance of that family re-establishing themselves and taking over their kingdom. This didn't happen in this exile. For God's promise stayed true, and King David's bloodline remained in place. They survived the exile. They carried on into Babylon, and they survived that exile. So however, the Judean royals and the bloodline was spared through the entire years of captivity. And though the reign of the Medes through the reigns, so it should be an R, through the reigns of the Medes and the Persians from 539 BC all the way through to 336 BC, they stayed intact. The impact of the exile was huge. And the subsequent captivity had a profound impact on the Israelites. Not really the Israelites, they were Jews at that point in time because it was only the tribe of Judah that was left. But what was left of it, the Israelites, it had a huge impact. And it can be found throughout the Old Testament. And I want to explore that a little bit more, the impact that this had on the Israelites. Even in the list of King David's descendants, as found in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verses 16, it states, the descendants of Jehoiakim, Jeconiah, his son, Zedekiah, his son, those were the last kings of the southern kingdom, and the sons of Jeconiah, the captive, not just anybody, the captive. Shealtiel, his son, Malchus, and the sons of Pedaiah, Zerubbabel and Shemiah. And here we have the list of Zerubbabel, a descendant of the kings of the southern kingdom that comes through. But what I want to point out here is the captive, the significance of that event. Zerubbabel himself was born a captive. He wasn't in the southern kingdom, he was in foreign lands, under foreign rule, under foreign jurisdiction, at risk. I would suppose, if the Medes and the Persians were really that strict about, taking out potential future enemies, he would be the one to take out. And they didn't. He was spared. He was probably brought up in the surrounding royal environment, but it was befallen on him to return to Jerusalem. So he became one of the leaders, but the governor, who returned with the first exiles to a ruined Jerusalem. Even through this crisis, God's promise to King David remained secure and intact. Despite what was happening around, God's promise remained true. And despite the royal privileges that Zerubbabel had, all elements of royalty had to be left behind in Persia. So in Persia, Susa, I think was the place's name, that's where the palace was. That's where the good food was. That's where the royalty could be found. That's where the education could be found. He probably had a much better home to stay in. Much better, if the Jews were looking after their royal family, being served on in a place that's, better looked after and built up and secure and not at the mercy of foreign people trying to attack it and adversaries trying to overcome it. Basically, as we know, the comfort of Cape Town and being taken to a deserted and a ruined place and being told, build it up again. So Zerubbabel had to give up all of those royal privileges left behind in Persia to return to a desolated city to begin the rebuild. opposition to the Jews was immense. It was difficult. The people around that were left behind in Jerusalem and the foreign people that had been displaced and were there, they didn't want these Jews back. And there was a kind of, if you want to come back, we need to be part of what you are doing. But a strict law of the Jews was they needed to stay pure, they need to stay separated, they had to do as God had instructed them as a set-apart family. So they rejected and they denied that the foreign people have access. And there was a good reason for this, and I'll get to that as well. So there was immense conflict. The Jews very nearly lost hope in the dire situation. And they could have given up and dissolved into a lost nation. That's how dire the situation was. Being tasked to come and rebuild a temple, rebuild a city, start from scratch, stand up against those adversaries that are trying to prevent you from being successful. I hope some of this sounds familiar. However, God still had purpose for his people, and he remained faithful that their purpose would indeed be fulfilled. He had a purpose for them. There was something that they needed to achieve, despite the adversaries that they were up against, despite the consequence that they found themselves in, despite the dire situation that befallen them. God had a purpose for them, and they were going to succeed. That purpose was to establish the establishment of Christ's kingdom, and Christ being the only means of salvation for all of mankind. That's what God's purpose was. And that's what he needed those Israelites to fulfill, to pursue. Now we might think, sure, Lord, I have my purpose, I have my dreams, I have my desires, what about my purpose? But God says, that's not what you are here for. We are here to serve God and see to his purpose. And through our actions, fulfill his purpose. Turn with me to Ezra chapter 2, verses 1. Ezra. So in the book of Ezra, this is when the Jews return from Babylon. Ezra comes later on, but it's Zerubbabel initially. Now these were the people of the province who came up out of the captivity of those exiles, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried captive to Babylonia. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town. They came with Zerubbabel, there he is, Jeshua, he was the high priest, Nehemiah, Seraiah, Relay, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mizpah, Bigvai, Rehum, and Baanah. And then there's a list of all the men that followed in the Ezra chapter 2. And roughly there were only 50,000 people who returned. A very small remnant in comparison with the number that left Egypt during the Exodus. And that number, though it counts only the men, we approximated 1.2 million people that left the Exodus on their way to the Promised Land. In comparison to that Exodus, only 4% in total in that first exile returned to rebuild, just 50,000 people. I think the population of Cape Town is 3 million. So it's probably the size of maybe less than Mitchell's Plain size, less than that, not even half of that, of people who returned to restart and rebuild a city. So because of this immense struggle that they were facing, God sends his messengers of encouragement. And of course, despite this dire situation, sends his messengers of encouragement. And the first person that comes on scene was Haggai, to encourage and question the people's priority versus those that were God's priority. So in the book of Haggai, he comes first on scene because after 20 years, the people lost hope. They were discouraged. They were not getting around to building that temple. And they were too busy with their own busyness of lives, paneling their own homes, and yet they were making no success of their homes because why? They had no place to worship God and give back to God and re-establish temple worship as it was meant to be. So the rebuilding of his temple so that people had a place to serve and to worship God. This was lacking when they returned. And Haggai comes on scene, sent by God, to question the people's priority and reaffirm that need to build that temple. Note, obviously, the temple wasn't for God's need, but for the people's need to serve God. So in Haggai chapter 1, verse 12, once hearing the message, the following is recorded. Then Zerubbabel, here he comes again, the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, with all the remnant, small parts of the people, obeyed the voice of the Lord their God. They obeyed. They heard what God had to say to them. And the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord their God had sent him. And the people feared the Lord. They recognized the significance of the message that Haggai brought. Then Haggai, the messenger of the Lord, spoke to the people with the Lord's message, saying, I am with you, declares the Lord. God is with you. God is with us. God is with me, declares the Lord. Do we think about that? Do we consider that? When we are in our struggles, do we face that struggle and say, I am on my own here? Or do we immediately bring to our recollection this statement from God? I am with you, declares the Lord. The second messenger was Ezra, to help teach the people the law, to re-establish God's commands for worship and for sacrifice, to help maintain the purity of the nation, speaking against intermarriage and re-establishing the Levites' function. The problem with the intermarriage brought unauthorized worship and customary practice from foreign nations into the Jewish nation, which regularly stood in contrast to God's requirements for his people. And we saw this, how King Solomon intermarried from a political point of view, but struggled, desperately struggled with all those wives, having to give in to their needs and desires. And as is the case even today, nothing's changed. To keep the peace in the relationship, men will bend to their wives' requests and customs as she has been brought up to know. I know this even in my own household. My brother is strong in the church, but not in the church, unfortunately. Teach their wives, but even today, many years later, to keep the peace, not in the church. Finally, Haggai encourages the Jewish leader, the governor of Judah, Zerubbabel, who had left the splendor of Persia to rebuild a city and a nation out of ruin and with many hostilities around him. He was facing a huge struggle. He had animosity. He had people who were discouraged. He had few people. He couldn't build an army out of that 50,000. That 50,000 needed to work the fields, to produce the food, had to build to put up walls, to build a temple, to secure funding. It was no easy task for him. But this is what God had to say to Haggai. Please turn with me to chapter 2, book of Haggai, chapter 2. And after Haggai, obviously having spoken to the people, now comes to speak to Zerubbabel. And it says, the word of the Lord came a second time to Haggai. On the 24th day of the month, speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I am about to shake the heavens and the earth, and to overthrow the throne of kingdoms. I am about to destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the nations, and overthrow the chariots and their riders. Chariots symbolizing strength. Chariots symbolizing warring individuals, having financial capability to expand their boundaries and territories. And the horses and their riders shall go down, every one by the sword of his brother. On that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord. So here, the key part, God encouraging Zerubbabel, despite the circumstances you find yourself in, I will make you a signet ring, for I have chosen you, I have selected you to fulfill my will. So, what is a signet ring? It's a ring that bears the symbol of power and authority. Signet comes from the Latin for signum, meaning sign or symbol, and it's traditionally used to mark and seal documents issued by the, capital V, authority by the pressing of the face on the signet of the ring into some wax. So, you've got a document, or maybe it was sealed, but there would be a wax stamp, and the seal, you would see the seal of the authority who put his signet onto that. Only the king wore that signet. It wasn't shared around, but that gave the document authority on what was stated on there. And it depicted authenticity of the document, an authority from whom the document came, and that the king himself had seen and authorized its contents. So there were many senior people who would put documents together, who would say to the king, this is now the law, and the king would probably say, go ahead, and out it would go. But those that had the signet ring on were specially signed by the king. Today, this practice is still necessary. We still need a signet ring. However, instead of a signet ring, we came up with the signature. So in the same way, we sign documents, we sign legal documents. You go to Foreign Affairs, you go to SARS, you go to the bank. I don't know, you sign your life away. We need to sign, but that's our symbol, our signature, that we had read the document and authorized whatever is on that document as it stands. If you sign an affidavit is a statement made out to somebody in person to say, this is what I'm saying is the truth, and you sign that document, it is binding, it is legal. You can be taken to court, to jail for perjury if you have said something that is false and incorrect on that document, or stated something verbally and it's incorrect. So, however, in the context here, the signet ring was to bear power and authority, to overthrow the throne of kingdoms and to diminish the strength of kingdoms and nations. Zerubbabel had none of this. With that small, insignificant, I would use, people that was with him, he was in no means, in no position to show power and authority. And yet, God was instilling the signet symbology on him that he would have that power, that God would, through him, have exercised power and authority. You have purpose. Each and every one of you have purpose. For God declared to Zerubbabel that he will be made like a signet ring, for God had chosen him. God had selected him for a purpose. Despite the dire circumstances, much more challenging, I think, than many of us are facing. Despite the surrounding adversaries who wish for him not to succeed, God had chosen him as his symbol of power and authority. Zerubbabel had to step up. This was a difficult task in front of him. Being designated governor and leader of the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem, he had to step up. Indeed, the Jews would forever be a vassal kingdom to a surrounding, more powerful kingdom. So throughout history, the Jews never became a powerful kingdom like those of King David and King Solomon's day. The Persians continued to rule, even though they allowed them to go back and re-establish themselves. The Persians continued to rule all the way through to 336 BC. Then on scene came the Greeks, who conquered the Persians and continued to rule even throughout Palestine area. And then the Greeks were conquered and the Romans came on board, and they conquered the territories that the Greeks had and ruled the Palestine area even into the days of Jesus. But this was all part of God's plan, not to overthrow those kingdoms, but to establish his kingdom, the kingdom of the church, Christ's kingdom. And the question I want to ask is, where are the Persians today? Where are the Greeks and the Romans today? For after 2,000 years later, God's kingdom still stands. His church is right here today and still remains. God fulfilled his purpose through Zerubbabel, just as he had said. Zerubbabel might not be able to have seen that purpose that he fulfilled, but God needed him to fulfill that. Let's conclude. Recognize that as Christians in God's church, while you are still alive today, God has a purpose for your life. Despite the consequences we find ourselves in, despite the struggles that we find ourselves in, and it is difficult out there, you are not alone. God has declared it. I am with you. The hopeless situation we might find ourselves in, the surrounding adversaries not wanting us to succeed, God still has purpose for you. For God declared, I am with you. God will ensure we succeed for his purpose and not for our own desires. So let us focus on his purpose. Let us be encouraged that the reason why I am still here, God has purpose for me in my life still. Let me fulfill that purpose. Life is but short. Let's not waste this opportunity to be that instrument of purpose for God and a servant to Christ. Zerubbabel is not remembered as the mighty king like David was. We'll probably, rarely hear his name as often as we hear David. But there was still purpose for him. But that was not his purpose, at least, needing to be a mighty king like David, but rather to lead his nation so that Christ could establish his mighty kingdom. Imagine that. Yesterday I attended Brother Nicholas Roder's funeral, and it was very evident from all those who were speaking what Brother Nicholas Roder's purpose was in his life. It came through, especially through his children, was to make, what his purpose was to make a difference in people's lives. And you could see from all those who attended just what an impact he made in their lives. They spoke about always doing better for others ahead of himself. That was his purpose, wanting to do better for others. His purpose to be an example, an encouragement for others. And this is what came through when they spoke of him. And from the many that attended his funeral, one can see just how many lives he touched and the impact he made to those around him. To conclude, let us take up the call and be God's signet ring. Be a symbol that people can see, this is God's servant before me. When we go out in the world, we bear that signet ring, that purpose that God has in our lives. A symbol of power and authority in this world, to serve mightily and to advance in God's service. Thank you everyone for the lesson. Let us be encouraged by this as we stand now and sing the song of invitation. If there's anybody in need of prayer, let it be known at this time.
Soon we'll come to the end of life's journey, and perhaps we'll never meet anymore, till we gather in heaven's bright city, far away on that beautiful shore. If we never meet again this side of heaven, but we struggle through this world and these trials. There's an easy place, this somewhere in heaven, by the shine of the river of life. There's a road Jesus live forever, and this separation comes no more. We will never meet again this side of heaven. I will meet you on that beautiful shore. Oh, to departed yet sorrow, benediction often bringeth our pain, but we never shall sorrow in heaven. God be with you till we meet again. If we never meet again, the side of heaven, forever. And the celebrations come no more. If we never meet again,